And welcome to the Trinity channel. My name is Dr. Tony Costa, and it's great to have you along on our program. We are dealing here, part two, with the sources of the Qur'an. Are the sources of the Qur'an heavenly or are they earthly? And when we were together the last time, we were talking about how the Qur'an makes these unique claims for itself. It claims that it has been sent down, as we read in Surah 2, verse 185. And it also makes the point that it cannot be imitated. The Qur'an is inimitable. You cannot imitate the Qur'an. It makes the challenge to reproduce a surah like unto it if you're able to, but then the Qur'an says, but you're not able to, and so it doesn't matter what you bring. The answer will always be, well, you can't do it because the Qur'an says you can't do it, so then if you can't do it, then why offer the challenge to start with? The Qur'an also challenges people to bring an ayah or a verse like unto one of its verses. And so the Qur'an does make the claim that it is a unique book, that its contents are heavenly, that its source is not earthly. It did not come from a human origin. It was not a human source, a human author that put together the Qur'an or wrote the Qur'an. It is in fact heavenly. It came from heaven and was sent down, according to Islamic tradition, during a 23-year period to Muhammad. Now, we also talked about how the Qur'an in three separate places speaks about and records a series of charges that were brought against it by the unbelievers or the disbelievers, where they came to Muhammad and they said, this is nothing new. These are ancient tales of the ancients. We've heard them all before. You're not bringing us anything new here, Muhammad. And the Qur'an responds to this by saying, no, these have been sent down. The contents have been sent down. And it responds to the charge that Muhammad was receiving his information from an advisor who the Qur'an says had a foreign tongue, as we read in Surah 68, verse 15. And according to the Islamic text, this was a Persian acquaintance of Muhammad. And the Qur'an, again, responds to that by saying that Muhammad's language is not Persian, it's Arabic, and therefore he could not have gotten this from this Persian informant. And the Qur'an goes on to point out that these ideas that the Qur'an has been fabricated or that it has been invented is nonsense, that it is indeed a heavenly text sent down. And then we started looking at some of these stories in the Qur'an, and we asked the question, well, are these stories really unique to the Qur'an? We looked at the story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5 and verse 31, and we saw how the story of Cain slaying his brother Abel and then learning how to bury his brother when a raven was sent. We found that this story was actually already well known to the Jews in particular, as it was found in the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, where we have the story said that a raven was sent from God to teach Adam and Eve in that account how to bury and dispose of the body of Abel. And so the idea here is not original to the Qur'an. It clearly comes from another source centuries before the Qur'an was written. And then the famous saying that whoever saves a life, it's as if they saved the whole world. Our Muslim friends are very fond of quoting that and saying, well, the Qur'an values human life. It says that if you save a life, it's as if you saved the whole world. And if you destroy a life, then it's like you've destroyed the whole world. But the fact of the matter is that saying, we also noticed, is not original to the Qur'an. Because centuries before, in the Jewish Mishnah, in the Mishnah, there is the saying there, it's talking about the slaughter of Abel by his brother Cain. And the the Mishnah goes on to say that whoever would save a life, it's as if he saved the whole world. And whoever would slay a person, it's as if he had slain the whole world. So this idea was clearly already in existence. This teaching, this saying was already in circulation long before the Qur'an came along. And there's no doubt that when Muhammad was in Medina, which had a very high Jewish population there, there's no doubt that Muhammad would have come across these stories. He would have heard of these stories. Now, we also talked a little bit about the other stories we find in the Qur'an. For instance, the Qur'an talks about the story of Abraham breaking the idols, his father's idols, and then being thrown into a fire by Nimrod, and then being delivered, as we see in Surah 21, verses 51 to 71. But this story, as interesting as it appears and as noble as it appears, was a story that was in circulation already in the Jewish communities of Arabia and other parts of the world. And the story of Abraham breaking his father's idols and then being thrown into the fire was already found in the Midrash Rabbah, which is one of the Jewish texts, along with the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in that story, we have exactly this same story being recounted about Abraham breaking his father's idols and then being thrown into the fire. The only problem, of course, when the Quran talks about Nimrod throwing Abraham into the fire, the only problem with that is we've got a historical problem, and that is Nimrod lived before Abraham. You find the story of Nimrod in Genesis 10 and 11, and he lived before Abraham, and so there's a bit of an anachronism there about Nimrod being alive in the days of Solomon. The story of Solomon and Sheba, or Suleiman in the Arabic, the story of Solomon and Sheba, as we read in Surah 27, verses 17 to 44, where Sheba comes all the way to hear Solomon, and she goes to his palace, and she travels to Solomon's palace, and we're told there that the floor of the palace was so bright, it was so shiny that she thought it was a sea of water. This story, again, was very well known. It was found already in the Targum of Esther, which was a Jewish writing, and the Targums were simply Aramaic translations or commentaries on the Old Testament. And so these Targums were already in existence prior to the Quran. And in this Targum of Esther, we have exactly the same story about Sheba coming to Solomon and how she thought the palace floor was a sea of water and so forth. The similarities are so close that this cannot be coincidence. The idea of scales being used in judgment, when the Quran talks about the scales being used on the day of judgment, if your good works outweigh your bad works, then you will enter paradise, and if your bad works outweigh your good works, then you will go into hellfire. This idea, found in the Quran 42 verse 17, in Surah 101 verses 6 to 9, is found in the Testament of Abraham. And the Testament of Abraham is a book or a text that comes from a collection known as the Pseudepigrapha. These were Jewish writings, intercanonical, that is, they were written between the Old and the New Testament period. And in the Testament of Abraham, it talks about the scales being used on the day of judgment when good works will be weighed against bad works. And again, what do we find here? This Testament of Abraham pre-existed long before the Quran. What about the story of God raising up Mount Sinai over the heads of the Israelites? We read in Surah 7, verse 171, that Allah took Mount Sinai and He raised it over the heads of the Jews, and He threatened to destroy them if they would not obey the Torah. Well, again, this story is found in a Jewish text known as Avodah Sarah. Avodah Sarah. So once again, this story was very well known to the Jews of Muhammad's day. And the Quran also points out in Surah 7, verse 148, and Surah 20, verse 88, the making of the golden calf. When the golden calf was made in the wilderness, the Quran says that it came out of the fire and it lowed. It actually mooed. And this story, again, is not new. This was already known in a Jewish text called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It was a text written by Rabbi Eliezer, which he said the golden calf came out of the fire and actually lowed. Again, this was written long before the Quran, but yet the Quran has the same story in its pages. The Quran speaks about the seven heavens. Where does this come from? Well, this was very well known to the Jews. It comes from the Jewish text known as the Haggadah, and it also comes from the Zohar. The Zohar is one of the books in the Jewish Kabbalah. What about the angels and Iblis being commanded to bow down and worship Adam? Well, we saw this in the Quran, Surah 234, but this comes from the life of Adam and Eve, another one of those intertestamental texts. What about Christian sources? Does the Quran copy from Christian sources? Well, what about the story of the 7 sleepers found in Surah 18? And we find there the story of these people who went into a cave and they slept for centuries. Where did the story come from? Is this unique? Well, not at all. We know this story. It was a Christian folklore. It came from the Latin work of Gregory of Tours. And Gregory of Tours wrote the text, The 7 Sleepers of Ephesus, where he recounts this story of these people going into a cave with their dog and actually sleeping for centuries and then waking up later. So once again, this is not new. Well, what about the Quran story about Mary, the mother of Jesus, Maryam, the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran, being dedicated and raised in the temple, according to Surah 3, verses 35 to 37? Well, this story, again, is nothing new. This was a very well-known story in Christian folklore. This comes from a text, a non-canonical gospel called the Protevangelium of James. And in this non-canonical text, we have the story of Mary being brought to the temple, being dedicated and raised in the temple, and so forth. So this was very well known among the Christians of Muhammad's day. Well, what about the story of Jesus speaking from the cradle when he was an infant, according to Surah 349 and Surah 100, Ayah 110? We read in the story that Jesus spoke from the cradle and said that he was the servant of Allah. And what about the story of Jesus making clay birds and animating them? Well, all of these stories, once again, were well known long before the Quran was written. They come to us from a non-canonical text known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where it tells us Jesus made little birds out of clay and animated them. He speaks from the cradle, but in that text, Jesus says, I am the Son of God. Whereas in the Quran, they drop the Son of God language and use the word, I am the slave of Allah, and so forth. What about the story of Surah 19 of Mary giving birth to Jesus under a palm tree, and how a water came forth from the trunk of the palm tree and so forth? Again, this was a very well-known story. It comes from the pseudo-gospel of Matthew, and the story tells us that Mary, she went and she retreated to a palm tree, and she gave birth under the palm tree, and water came forth and so forth. This, again, was well known to the Christians of Muhammad's day. Folks, why do we have all these stories circulating long before the Quran? And yet, when the critics told Muhammad this is nothing new, the Quran responds by saying, no, none of this comes from any human source. It comes from Allah. And the idea in the Quran about Jannah, of paradise, the idea that paradise is a place of wine and milk and rivers of wine and so forth, and it mentions the Houris and so on. All of these ideas were already in existence in Persian sources. In fact, the word paradise is a Persian term. It's a Persian word that had to do with the gardens. And in the Persian language, paradise meant garden. And that's why you'll notice the Quran will make reference to the gardens, inheriting the gardens, and so forth. In Zoroastrianism, we find in Zoroastrianism that it also speaks about the wide-eyed Houris, those whose eyes are like pearls, and how they will serve the righteous and those who've died and moved on into Jannah. You'll find this in Zoroastrian sources. Now you see, folks, what do we find here? The Quran claims to be heavenly, but yet what we find is that when we look into it and critically assess it, what we find is that the stories in there are really nothing new. So has the Quran been sent down from God, or is it of an earthly source? I think if you've been listening and if you've been analyzing the evidence for yourself, you would find that it does come from a human source. And so I hope that this information will help you, that it will challenge you, and that you would use your God-given mind to investigate these issues further and come to the realization that we need truth more than anything else. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.